curator for Written, Michelle and Myrna Anderson, my predecessor, created this activity and this event many, many years ago. And so we're glad to have it back.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the evening.
And Leatrice also has information about an event that's happening in August with Tina Anson McElroy.
Yes. We'll be going down to St. Simon's Island to see Tina, spend the day with Tina, talk to her about her work, talk to her about the island, and it's an overnight trip. So if you go to our website, it's under excursions, and please join us and go and hang out with Tina McElroy Anson, because we're like, Tina, everybody brings you to Atlanta all the time. We're gonna come down to St. Simon's Island on the island, and she likes visitors, so come and join us.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Again, my name is Michelle Gibson. I'm the publisher of Written Magazine. We have had this partnership with the Hammons House going on 8 years now, so we're very excited to continue this under the new director. And so ecstatic to have Emily Bernard. Emily is a native Nashvilleian who currently lives in Vermont. She is a professor at the University of Vermont. And she's Warren Bernard's big sister, which is where I know her from. I went to school with her brother at Hampton University, and we subsequently worked together at a magazine called Black Issues Book Review. So if you all remember the early 2000s, we had all these Black book magazines, so Black Issues Book Review is one of those. He was our art director, and I was the director of advertising, so we've got a little history. So Emily's book, the book prior to this was Between Friends.
Some of my best friends.
Some of my best
Yes.
friends. And this memoir of essays is an Oprah Book Club selection. So we're very excited to have Emily. Please help me welcome Emily.
Welcome. Thank you so much. I love our connection. It is always remarkable what a small world it was for all of us. There's always just
I
2
know.
degrees of separation.
I know. And it was joyful reading the book, and I was like, she talked about what? So you have those connections. And bigger than that, I'm from Nashville as well. So just reading about, and I've never been able to eloquently explain to people what Nashville used to be. So post, pre-Tennessee Titans and the Nashville Predators, it wasn't that. And it was a city separated by the North and the South, and you so eloquently described our experience. So if you have not had an opportunity to read Emily's book, we're going to try to unpack it as much as possible. You all know that I'm a reader. For those who have been to a Wine Words event before, you know I'm a reader. So I won't spoil things for you, but just to have enough for you to understand why we love this book so much. So, Emily's life is very interesting, and I found it a unique space in literature for this book, because we always read about, or even in media, we see the duality of the Black experience, where you have to code switch for corporate America, and then you go to your Black community with your Black family, and you're living your Black life, or you are stereotypical hood in your Black experience and get thrown into a very white world where you have to figure out and fumble, and so those seem to be very common themes in our culture as far as what's getting published and what's being read. Your experience is very different. You have a very firm, strong African American heritage that you know about. It's not like it was a secret. Your generations know of your history of your family, and you selected going up north, and you picked your environment. And what came across is you write in an unapologetic way about your experience, where I feel some authors feel burdened to kind of explain or over-explain, and then I was like, well, maybe that's not true for her. Maybe you do have the burden, you just didn't write from that perspective. So.
Well, I love everything you're saying, and I was very conscious as I was putting this book together. So I started the book just a series of independent essays. I really didn't think of myself as writing a book. And the first essay that I wrote that became part of this collection was an essay called Teaching the N-Word, which I wrote in response to a class I was teaching at UVM. It was me in a classroom full of 10 lovely white students. And African American autobiography. So the ironies just began, the first day. And, the word comes up in our reading. And I just decided that I was going to write about the experience as it was. And I wasn't going to give a lecture about it because, what happens, of course, in our culture is that some white person says the word and then, goes on Oprah or an equivalent and a grand mea culpa, I'll never do it again.
Right.
And that person may or may not get their career back.
Right.
And then it happens again, And so there's a way that the lectures just aren't working. And I was really interested then in the kind of question of what is so compelling about that word.
Right.
And so I decided, when I very much think of myself as a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
but in the classroom, and I teach at the University of Vermont, so my students come in, I have, I'm lucky if I get 4 or 5 students.
I love how you say, I may be the first black teacher they've ever had.
Some of them, I tell a story in here about I had a white student who had never talked to a black person before. She was in my class, but when she came to UVM, she fell in with this really fantastic, vibrant group of young black women who thought of her like this, like she was a unicorn, right? It's like, how is that possible? So when she was in my class, they would prompted her to tell the story, because that was hilarious.
Right.
And she said that she had seen a black man once in a bus station stop, and she wanted to speak to him, but there was no ruse,
Right.
So anyway, so that was a long time ago, but I'm very aware. I mean, that's the story of higher education in this country. It becomes more and more expensive and more exclusive, In some variety, we're dealing with that. So I'm always very conscious of what I represent to the students, and I write about that too, the way I dress,
Mm-hmm.
and that essay that, I never come to class in jeans, that's just not, that's not something I would ever do.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I'm in that classroom, I realize what I'm representing, and I'm there thinking of my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and what it means for them, for me to be in that room.
Right.
But when I go into the class, the students start sometimes below zero, so I have to tell them things, I'm starting with the tradition, I'm ending up, and they have to come out with some knowledge, but the essay form for me, or me as the writer, I get to meander, and I get to contradict myself. And so even in the essay, the structure, I wanted there to be gaps, because I said, I'm not gonna give you a lecture, because again, the lecture's not working.
Yes.
The short answer is no, don't say it.
Right.
I have enough of a reputation at my school now that the students don't come to me and ask that question, like, they know what I'm gonna say.
Right.
I'll say to my students of color too, say what you like, but know that no one was ever lynched being called Mr. Johnson.
Right.
So that's the history that word carries. And for, I have students, well, I'm not responsible. Well, we're all responsible for history. History made us. We don't get to decide, what part we want, what we don't want. And I'll also say, sure, language is elastic, and I would never tell someone what to say, but as my grandmother would say, don't write a check with your mouth that you're behind can't catch.
Yes.
Now go forth.
Right. But you've been warned. You have been warned.
And I have no choice.
I love how you made your class everyone's class, because so many times when you get titles of African American literature, it's like, oh, this is the white people's class, or the Hispanic diaspora, oh, this is only for Latinos, when it's an American story. And in order for your students who may not be of color to connect with the story, they have to own it, own the responsibility of it's a part of their telling as well.
And I think it's a delicate thing, because, I always tell my students, they come in and say things like that, white students, well, I don't understand this, I don't understand, how can I understand Frederick Douglass? And I'll say, well, I was never a slave in the 19th century. So this experience, I don't carry it,
Right.
But at the same time I do, So,
Right.
But the essay is really that question, like, I am a human being, and I'm a black human being, and I'm a woman, and I bring that with me everywhere I go. But I'm also a teacher, and you are not entitled to my personal experience. And in some ways, the book, what you were saying at the beginning is exactly the dilemma I had, and I think it took me a long time, because I love that you see this. I think of my experience in some ways as, an African American as is not, is sort of typical.
Right.
You know, and that we live race, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
it's always shifting, you know,
Mhm.
right? It's never exactly, we're not living blackness in capital letters all the time. You know,
Right.
sometimes we're living in other ways, and we're
Right.
just trying to go to the bank.
Right.
And,
Right.
you know, my friend, a woman that is my kind of a mentor, she says, I just went out of the race business, I'm on vacation, you know? So, you know, but I wanted to tell that story, and I think I internalized in some ways that mandate, or what you were talking about, the
Mhm.
ways that our stories are often, they have become so public.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
you know, I also am suspicious sometimes of the publishing industry.
Yes.
Because you wonder, what kind of stories are people investing in?
Yes.
You know, and
Yes.
to what degree are our struggles becoming literally something people want to consume?
Yes.
You know, and with every video we can see now, I mean, some of that reflect on that, you know, it just, what does it mean that we can watch someone being
Killed.
in real time? You know,
As it's happening.
As it's happening.
Yes.
And on one hand, I think about, you know, Emmett Till's mother, who insisted that the world witness, you know, her son's bloated, battered body, and said, you must witness this.
Right.
And how it started a movement, really. On the other hand, I think, again, is somewhat, you know,
Mm-hmm.
who's watching these videos just like pulling up with a bowl of popcorn?
Right.
And saying,
Right.
let me watch this.
As if it was fiction.
As if, right, and it just like, oh, you know, kind of
Right.
a thrilling story.
Right.
So, you know, I just one story. It kind of kept me questioning about what my book would contribute. You know, because the stories of the struggles are important, and I didn't experience the things that we often see out there.
Mhm.
Is my story?
Right.
Is it black? Is it even black?
Right.
You know,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Is it doing
Yes.
that work?
Yes.
You know, to intervene. But then
But it's so very black, and that's
Yeah,
what
I agree.
I love about it, is because you don't apologize for, you didn't grow up in the hood, you didn't have to strive and overcome, and not that those stories are insignificant.
Right.
It's just that we're not monolithic in that way, and so if there isn't a space for your story,
Right.
then what is the space about? And I actually wrote, I said, it's unique because we all know the person who's the black woman in the room, but we've never read that story. And we don't know what it's like for you to travel in that sphere all the time.
Yeah.
So it's easy because you write about people popping into your life and making assumptions about it, like because you're married to a white man, and so they make this assumption of what type of black you have to be to marry outside of your race, or what type of black you have to be to live in Vermont, and they're so very wrong. And but I mean we are full of assumptions about people, and so when you contrast that with the grace in which you accept it. Because my head would have spun around like a couple of times in this book. But you have such wonderful grace for people and their questions and their curiosity. And the courage to write this part of the story, the African American story, because I think people take for granted, I think non-blacks take for granted the black person in the room as being comfortable.
Yes, I agree.
All the time.
All the time. They have no idea about our interior experience. I agree. And I like that, you know, so you're right, interracial marriage, and I wanted to write an essay that, you know, responded to, and in the essay, literally a friend of mine who is Mexican American, I think I hope it now, they call it males, asked me once, you know, recently, like, what is it like being married to a white man? And it was just kind of an extraordinary question, because at the time my husband, we were trying to exchange keys to get the kids. It's like,
Right.
well, I mean, it's like being married to somebody who has my key.
Right.
Also, I think when people, again, the assumption one that his family was the one who had to be won over. But in fact, it was my family.
Right.
That, you know, my aunts and my uncles, and you know,
Your dad is my dad. Because I was in love with Duran Duran, and I kept saying to my dad, I'm marrying Simon Le Bon, bring him home, get ready for our British babies. And my daddy was like, nope.
Yep.
That's not why I had you. You were not married outside of your race. And it took a while of, Dad, just listen to Duran Duran. You're gonna love him. Like, and that's a comical view, but
Yeah.
I had those conversations.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think, you know, same thing with my, and I write about this, my beloved father, you know, very old school, very, you know, West Indian patriarch, and my daughter is gonna do this, and she's gonna do this, and, you know, I got old.
Yeah.
And he was like, just please marry someone.
Right. Different set of concerns.
I found something with my husband, you know, his Italianness, he's
Right.
And the food, so that's what really.
Yes.
But people, again, the assumptions, you know, you know, my husband, in some ways, our biggest issue is class, which I don't know if I explained, because my husband's family, you know, they immigrants, and they didn't go beyond the 8th grade. My parents went to Meharry, you know, and so that's also, that's our story, right?
Right.
Two-parent home with
Right.
the parent, you know, this kind of thing.
Forever two-parent home.
That is
Yes.
our story,
Yes.
and so again, I'm always, yes, I am amused sometimes by the assumptions,
Yes.
because if anything, our class differences sometimes surprise me,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something, you know, I don't think about.
Right.
But my husband, even recently, my daughter's, I went to take him to the doctor. He's like, "You're always going to the doctor," and I said, "You know, my father was a doctor.
Right.
They're at our disposal.
Right.
For him, you know, going to the doctor, you know,
It's a big
imagine
thing.
for your father who did not speak English well, had a 3rd grade education. It was a big deal, but it's not, you know. So it's interesting to me how we relate as
Right.
individuals, and then even more broadly,
Right.
you know, the ways that race can appear and reappear in a relationship.
Right.
Sometimes it can be defining, and sometimes it can just recede,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And even with my children, we adopted our daughters, they're born in Ethiopia.
Mhm.
And watching them evolve, which is a huge reason I wrote the book, because
Right.
I was so interested, like, you know, the stories I carry from my ancestors.
Mhm.
You know, they're so alive, right, for so many of us. I mean, in the course of thinking about this book, I thought, you know, there's stories about my grandparents' marriage
Mhm.
that I tell that feel fundamental to me about who I am
Mhm.
and the choices that I wasn't there,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So they don't really, it's just my imagination.
Right.
But now as my kids get older and they start
If
to
you
tell
see the-
stories,
yes.
like thinking, oh, that's what
Yes.
they're picking from.
Yes.
To say, well, this is why I do what I do because it's different than my mother.
Right.
And also watching them experience blackness, you know.
Yes.
I grew up in a home, my parents, you know, would say, my mother was, and I would say, Mom, not everything is about race. And now I find myself, my daughters have to bite my tongue sometimes. They'll say something happened in school, and I'll say, oh, really? Is that teacher again? What does she look like? And so I'm kind of, you know, and I'm there and
Right.
trying to, recently I just had to tell a story of my daughters, so watching them now, they're 13, and so they're a lot older than,
Right. And they're twins.
and they're twins. So my daughter was in, and thinking about race in Vermont, was in Old Navy. And she called me, she was with a girlfriend who was biracial,
Mhm.
very light skinned, and in
Mhm.
fact had her hair blonde at some point.
Mhm.
They were really good friends. And I always think of this girl as black.
Right.
You know, we've never talked about it, but I always think of her that way. So they were in Old Navy, and my daughter Isabella was, you know, they have those, you're checking out all the perfumes. So
Yes.
her friend Olivia was spraying, you know, fooling around there at 13. And a white woman behind her said to my daughter, who's very brown skinned,
Mhm.
and said, if you're not gonna buy that, please stop spraying it. So my daughter said, well, I wasn't even spraying it, but of course, she calls me. And she said, Mommy, this happened to me. And my first response was, is she still in the store?
Right. Right.
But her response was, you know, she said to me immediately, because I always will say to them, you know, I've got my back.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And she said, Mommy, I don't want you to go around scaring people. And I thought to myself, though, what am I bringing with me to these experiences, right?
Right.
My history.
Right.
And she wanted a chance to figure out for herself. And she said, you know, do you think that she spoke to me this way because my skin is brown?
Mm.
And I said, this woman sounds like a miserable person. And, you know, she said the daughter had looked sympathetic. I said, yeah, you're right. I said, here's one thing I'm going to tell you. Don't ever question yourself. Because, you know, isn't that, you know, I
That's
think
good advice.
sometimes we're told, are you sure? You know, we
Right.
internalize that, right? Am I sure? And that is,
Right.
of course, the experience, I think, of living in our bodies. That
Mhm.
you never really, you know, why. But I thought, that's what I want, you know, even if they kind of have to shoot first and take names later.
Yes.
I want them
Yes.
to feel confident that their reading of the situation
Yes.
is correct. Because I don't want them to have, it's too hard already growing up hyper visible in these
Mhm.
spaces.
Mhm.
And we were visited all the time, like, you know, they're like, what are we doing here?
Mhm.
So we'll talk about that.
Mhm.
And I always have an eye, frankly, on the door.
Right.
I don't want them to, you know, I don't want them to, I want them to live full lives. And right
Right.
now, what we're doing is traveling.